All right. So today's class, we're just going to be doing review. So I've got those practice problems. So we'll go to files. In fact, you can find them under files, exam one materials. I also moved them so they're, looks like another module, but they're just kind of all in the same place here. We'll kind of look at this participation quiz later today. So we've got this practice exam. We've got the answer key. So I'll just open up this practice exam. I'll take some questions from you guys here in a second, but this will be kind of the main thing that we go through. If you have questions on other practice problems, we can take a look at those. Although these questions, once again, this practice exam should be very similar to the exam that you will take tomorrow from 11:15 to 3:15. So once we are done today, under this exam one materials review, you'll see the actual exam pop up. It won't be accessible until tomorrow at 11:15. You can start anytime within that 4-hour time block. Once you start, you'll be kind of locked in for an hour and 15 minutes. I think I had a question before about whether or not I'm using like a lockdown browser. So I'm not using anything that's outside of Canvas. There is one that's built in, so it will kind of lock your browser so you can't use Google, things like that. However, it should be work with every kind of main browser, so Chrome, Firefox, all of those. It should be not a problem. Once you start, the time will. Once you start, the clock will start. So you have an hour and 15 minutes to complete the exam once you start it. So do not click on that exam one link until you are ready to start tomorrow. Okay. I should have my phone, a laptop in front of me during that entire time. So if there's any issues, send me an email immediately. I don't think there should be any, but I will be, accessible during that time if you do have an issue. Okay. Other than that, 25 multiple choice questions on that exam. It'll cover modules 1 through 4. So everything we've covered up to this point. I can make sure you guys can see these complete slides that we went through yesterday because we finished up module 4. So I'll start here. Are there any questions logistically about the exam before we just dive in to start kind of reviewing some problems? Okay. I also put up this formula. It's, you can use for the exam. So this is just that midpoint formula. You should have that in your notes, or you can have that if you want to print it out and have it in front of you. But this is kind of our midpoint formula that you might, wink, wink, have to use. It should auto grade, although I don't think it'll show you your score until after it's closed. So you might not be able to see your score until 3:15, right at the end of that time block. Any other questions on that? And it won't score as you go. So it'll be just like you're taking a typical exam. You'll kind of fill out every single question, submit it, and then it'll be graded after the fact. Okay. Does that answer your question? Is that what you were asking? Hopefully, yes. Okay. Any other questions logistically before we jump into specific problems?
Sorry, you said that it will be using Lockdown browser for the exam?
Yeah, so I'll have it kind of set. It's kind of done through Canvas. It kind of locks your browser so that you can, not use Google, things like that as you're taking it.
Okay, thank you.
But you don't have to like download anything or sign up. It's all built into Canvas.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was just wondering about.
Nope, no, it's not like an outside thing. It'll just be something that a setting that I have to kind of set on Canvas.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. So, are there any specific problems people want to see worked through? If you've gotten a chance.
Sorry, I actually do have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, so you're actually cutting off from me right there. Did you mention how many questions there were? No, I just missed it.
Yep. 25 multiple choice questions. So, like I said,
Perfect.
it'll look very similar
to the
Practice exam.
review.
Practice exam only has 20 questions. So
Okay.
those other 5 might come from, you kind of notice this starts with like module 2. Some of it might come from some basic module 1 stuff about opportunity costs. So if you're kind of worried about some of the more of those module 1 questions, I would go back and look at those practice problems for module 1.
Okay, thank you.
Take a
Sounds
look at
good.
those today too if you have questions on them.
Thank you.
Any problems people had that they want to see worked through? Okay, number 8. Okay. So let's go down here. So we've got substitutes in consumption. So I've got 2 goods, right? This is going to be thinking about, we're talking about like supply and demand. So module 3, I'm buying either beer or hard seltzers. I've got substitutes in consumption here. The price of beer increases. What happens to the equilibrium quantity and price? Okay. So how would I solve this one, right? So I've got 2 goods. So we had what? Hand sanitizer. We had what? I already forget. Beer, I think it was. Yep. So we'll just do B here. And I have the price of beer is increasing, right? So this is how I would kind of work through problems, like write down what I'm looking at or what I know about. And I'm thinking about what's happening to that equilibrium quantity for hand sanitizer and what's happening to that equilibrium price. Okay. So if we're thinking about hand sanitizer, I've got quantity of hand sanitizer here. I've got the price of hand sanitizer. If I'm told that these 2 goods are substitutes in consumption, okay? So if these are substitutes in consumption, that word consumption is consumers, demand. I should be thinking about, I've got this demand curve, right, starting out here. There would also be some supply curve, and the initial equilibrium price and quantity would be where supply is equal to demand. Okay. If I have substitute goods, right, then when the price of one good goes up, right, what's going to happen to the demand for its substitute? So if beer is more expensive, people are going to buy less beer and substitute towards the now relatively cheaper good. So with substitutes in consumption, when the price of one good goes up, the demand for the other product will also increase. Okay. What does a demand increase look like? Well, this is whether we're talking about supply or demand. Always think about we're moving away from this 0 point. So how would demand move away from that point? Shift to the right, right? Or at every single price, the quantity demanded is now higher, right? So here is kind of our rightward shift or increase in our demand curve. What has that done? Well, it's changed the equilibrium. Where does supply equal demand now? To a higher quantity and a higher price. Okay. So here we had to know what substitutes in consumption, what that relationship was between the price of one good. This is like the price of X and then the demand, or we can think about here, sorry, price of good Y and the demand for good X. So once we know that relationship, we also have to know how to increase demand, right? Or what that would look like on a graph. And then identifying that equilibrium point is where supply is equal to demand. So where would that equilibrium move? Okay. Any questions here before that answer? Hopefully the person had that question. So this is the actual question. I'm going to do something that might be helpful. So this was substitutes in consumption. Right? What if I had the exact same setup, but I was looking at substitutes in production? So let's say I have a production facility and I can produce either beer or hard seltzers. So there, if the price of beer goes up, right, and I kind of start out thinking about, I've got some supply curve, some demand curve. Here was my initial equilibrium, and here we're looking at hand sanitizer. So here was my initial equilibrium quantity. Here's my initial equilibrium price. If there's substitutes in, production, if the price of beer goes up, if I'm the producer, am I going to be more or less likely to want to supply this good? More likely to supply beer, which means if I'm changing my production process over to produce more beer, what's happening to the supply of that other good? It's going down. Right? So if instead of substitutes in consumption, this was substitutes in production, well, first of all, production, we should be thinking about the supply curve. So we should be seeing a shift there. And the relationship between substitutes and production is exactly the opposite of substitutes and consumption. So now I've got this supply decrease. What does that look like? At every price, quantity supplied is now lower, or I've got this leftward shift, right? We're moving towards that 0 point. What has that done to my equilibrium? Well, if it was a supply decrease, right, I'm going to end up seeing that the equilibrium quantity goes down and the equilibrium price goes up. So make sure you're paying a very careful attention, especially when we're talking about complements and substitutes. If it's substitutes in consumption, you would have an increase in demand here. If it's substitutes in production, there we would see a supply decrease. Right? So once again, consumption, demand, production or producers, supply shifts. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. Any other questions that people wanted to see? Number 3. Yeah, so let's think about number 3 here. Okay, so if I have a production possibilities frontier, right? So this kind of use these two terms interchangeably. I would be more likely on the exam, since I think what I had in the slides was this production possibilities curve, right? Or production possibilities frontier. Those are really two different names for the same thing. So we've got two different goods our economy can produce. Now, I gave you kind of a simplistic version on question 3. So I think it looks like here, like a straight line, right? We know that in practice, if I actually had my production possibilities curve and I had any two goods, right? So I think in this example was what? Pizza and burgers. So it doesn't really matter which one I put on which axis for this question, but I'll line it up. So instead of a straight line, what did we say our production possibilities curve is going to look like? Well, for the entire economy, we said it's going to have this kind of bowed outward shape, right? And the reason why is because what is the slope? And I'm reviewing some things that aren't in this problem that might be important. So what's happening to my slope as I produce more of this x-axis good? It is increasing. What does the slope of my production possibilities curve or production possibilities curve tell me? It was the opportunity cost of our x-axis good. Okay. So as I produce more of these burgers, if I'm staying on the curve, that means that I'm going to have to start giving up more and more pizza, and it's going to become more and more costly. Right? That slope is going to become steeper. So any point on this curve, we said was what? Well, that was where the curve represents I'm using all of my resources to produce these two goods. We said this would be production efficient. Okay. Any point below this curve would represent, well, if I could be producing this combination of pizza and burgers here, if I'm producing somewhere down here, what am I doing? Well, we've got the same amount of burgers but less pizza. I could be up here. I'm not using all of my resources. So any point below our curve, we said was inefficient.
Professor Lantis, I think that was number 4 on the practice exam
Oh,
and not number
sorry.
3.
Thank you. You're right. I'll go back to number 3
Thank
after
you.
we finish this one. Thank you for
Mhm.
So on number, and this will actually help us for number 3 a little bit as well. So any point above this curve we said was unattainable, right? I only have enough resources to be producing here. So if I have the same amount of burgers, there's no way I can produce more pizzas because this point told me I was using all of my resources already. Okay. So how do we find kind of different points on this curve? Well, when we only had a 2-person economy, like in question 3, the actual question 3, right? How do I know which of these points are going to be on that curve? Okay. Well, I've got two individuals in the example or information given to me above. And Dennis is producing 40 green eggs, 120 t-shirts. Frank is 70 green eggs, 140. So what I'm going to do for a question like this is draw out each individual's production possibilities curve first. Okay. So here I'm going to put, and we could do it either way, but green eggs and t-shirts on my X and Y axis. Okay. So for the first person, Dennis, it was they can either produce 40 green eggs and 0 t-shirts or 120 t-shirts and 0 green eggs. So their production possibilities curve would look something like this. And then for Frank, we had what? 70 green eggs and 140 t-shirts. Okay. So one thing that we'll need in order to then build our economy-wide production possibilities curve, make sure you can see this, is if both of these individuals are only producing t-shirts, how many total would we have in our economy? Well, 140 from Frank, 120 from Dennis, we'd be at what? 260. And then if we're only producing green eggs, what would the total amount I have be? 110. Now for our economy-wide production possibilities curve, it's not going to be a straight line, right? Because initially, who are we going to rely on to first start producing this x-axis good? Whoever can produce it at a lower cost. How do I find the cost of both individuals? That's the slope of their production possibilities curve. We just talked about that with the kind of more continuous production possibilities curve. So how do I find the slope here? Change in y over change in x. So going from this point to this point, going down by 120 over 40, got what? -3 is the cost to getting one more of that x-axis good to Dennis. For Frank, be what? 140 over 70. So -2, or the cost would be 2 t-shirts to get one more green egg from Frank. So who are we going to rely on first to start producing these green eggs? Who can produce it at a lower cost? That's going to be Frank. Okay. So we can always find these two extreme points. The next point we want to find is this point in the middle, which represents where initially I'm going to be relying on who can produce this x-axis good at the lowest cost. Well, once Frank has used all of his resources to only be producing green eggs, how many total do we have? 70. We only have t-shirts coming from Dennis now, so we would be at a point here of 120. And then if I want to produce anything past 70 green eggs, Dennis or Frank has used all his resources, I have to start to rely on Dennis. So my slope of my production possibilities curve is now going to be -3. Okay. So just using these 3 points, let's think about, can we determine which of these is not on the curve? Well, 7120, well, that was one of those points. That was the point in the middle that we found. So that one's on the curve. 0 to 60, that was one of our intercepts. So that one's easy. So hopefully we can kind of rule those out just using those 3 points. Now it gets a little trickier for these two. Okay. So let's think about this point of 80-90. Really, in order to determine whether or not it's on your curve, you'll have to kind of check to see if that is a possible point. So 80 green eggs, 90 t-shirts, is that going to be a point that's on our curve? Well, if I did want to produce 80 green eggs, who am I going to rely on past 70 to start producing these? I'm going to have to rely on Dennis, right? So if I want one more green egg, it's going to cost me 3 t-shirts. So 10 more green eggs here is going to cost me 30 t-shirts. So from this point, if I want to increase that x good by 10, I'm going to have to decrease that y good by 30. So the point that would be on the curve is 80-90. Well, so we now know that point's on the curve. Hopefully the last one is the one that's not, right? So the last point was 40 green eggs and 140 t-shirts. Okay. So hopefully when I check this one, it's not on the curve. So if I was going to be at 40 green eggs, who would I be relying on to first produce those first 40? Whoever can produce it at the lowest cost. I haven't used all Frank's resources yet. So to get 40 more green eggs, each one's costing me 2 t-shirts. This would be a total cost of 80. So moving from this point, where the quantity of green eggs was 0, to 40, the point that would be on the curve, I'd have to do what? Reduce by 80. So 260 minus 80 is going to be what? 180. So the point that's on my curve is 4180. The point that was given to me in the problem was 4140. So actually, no, and I didn't leave myself a lot of room here, but I would know that would have to be at a point that's actually below my curve. So using these 3 points, right, a lot of the times you can rule out some easier answers, right? So we could rule out when A and C was on the curve, and then the remaining 2 points, kind of using this method I just worked through, we can check to see if those would be on the curve or not. Okay. Any questions on that one? So don't get tripped up. You might look at this and say, well, no, they could be producing 40 and 140. Yes, they could be, right? But is that point going to be on the curve? No, it's actually underneath it. So we would say that point of 40, 140, well, we would actually be relying on Dennis to start producing green eggs. Well, he had a higher cost, so that would actually be inefficient, or we'd end up at one of these production inefficient points if we did that. Okay. Probably one of the trickier, or I shouldn't say tricky, harder questions on the exam would just gonna be something like this. But I can almost guarantee you, you will see something just like these 3, where you have 2 individuals, 2 goods. They'll have different production amounts, so different costs. You'll have to determine what the costs are for each, for one of those goods, determine who has absolute comparative advantages, and then also figure out which of these points is either on the curve or not on the curve would be a question that you'll guarantee you will see. Okay. All right. Any other problems we want us to look at? All right. Let's again. So, okay. So let's say I gave you a supply and demand equation. Okay. So I think here we've got, here's our demand equation, quantity demanded. Here's our supply equation. How would I find the equilibrium quantity and price? So my demand equation was 160 minus 3Q. My supply equation was here. Right? So I did include the notation here of supply and demand. One thing I might do is, instead of having these up here, I might just kind of write out the supply and demand equations. How could you know which of these is the demand equation here? So if I didn't tell you which one was the demand equation, why do you know it's going to be this one? Well, we're thinking about supply and demand, right? Our supply curve is always upward sloping, representing increasing marginal costs. Demand is downward sloping, representing decreasing marginal benefits. So the equation that has a negative slope, we know that's going to be our demand equation. And then the equation that has a positive slope, we know that has to be our supply equation. Now, to find this equilibrium, right, technically, I really wouldn't need to identify which of those was supply or demand, but that might be more important if I'm trying to find marginal costs and marginal benefits like in 10 and 11. Okay? So once I've got these 2 equations, I'm looking for what price is that quantity supplied the same as the quantity demanded. So I'll set these 2 equations equal to each other, or it's the equilibrium is where supply is equal to demand. So demand was 160 minus 3Q. Set that equal to supply, 20 plus 4Q. Now it's just a little bit of algebra. All right, I'll subtract 20 from both sides, add 3Q to both sides. I get what? 140 is equal to 7Q. Divide both sides by 7, and I get that quantity is equal to what? 20. So my equilibrium quantity, the point where supply would be equal to demand, is going to be at a quantity of 20. Okay. From there, how do I find my equilibrium price? Well, this is where you only have to choose one of these, but you could choose both to kind of convince yourself that you didn't make a math error. So once I have that equilibrium quantity, right, I'm going to then plug that back into my demand equation. If I do that, what? 160 minus 3 times 20 is 100. So the equilibrium price, right, should be $100. Now, what I could also do is hopefully if I plug that price back into my supply equation, hopefully I get the exact same value. So if I have my supply equation and I plug 20 into that, what value do I get? Sure enough, I get that same equilibrium price of 100. Okay. So, and more generally, if I'm looking at these solve for the equilibrium price and quantity using equations problems, first thing you'll do is set that supply equation equal to your demand equation. Use algebra to solve for that equilibrium quantity. Plug that equilibrium quantity into your supply or demand equation, or to check yourself, both. And then, right, you'll have a little bit of algebra. Not algebra, it's really just plugging a number in, kind of into this equation, and then that will solve for your equilibrium price. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. Any other problems people want to see worked through here? Feeling good about every single other question? We're going to ace this exam. Okay. Oh, there's some. 16. Perfect. So, all right, this is some newer stuff from Module 4. So let's say I gave you the price of a textbook is increasing by 20. I've got the resulting change in quantity supplied and in quantity demanded. Okay. So here, we're talking about the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply. It's always going to be the price elasticity. So what's changing? Initially, we're seeing a change in the price, or a percentage change in the price that will go in our denominator. For demand, we're then thinking about, okay, in response to that, how much is the quantity demanded changing by in terms of percentages? And then for supply, it would be how much does the supply change by in terms of percentages? Okay. So in this example, we had what? A 20% change in price. We had quantity supplied, percent change was 40, and the percentage change in quantity demanded was 5%. Okay. So here, it's just going to be a matter of plugging these values into our elasticities, right? So for demand, we'd have what? 5 over 20. Now, even if you don't plug these in, you can kind of see, okay, there's a 20% change in price. As a result, people only responded by 5%. And, if this was actually a price increase, this was technically like -5, right? It was going down. We'll talk why in a second. We don't worry about the negative sign. Because one thing I didn't add in here is when we're looking at the elasticity of demand, what do we always do? Just look at the absolute value. But that percentage change in price was greater than the percentage change in the quantity demanded, which means people are not being very responsive. If people aren't being as responsive in terms of how much they buy, as what the actual percentage change in the price was, well, this fraction is going to be less than 1. Anytime we have an elasticity less than 1, we would say it's inelastic. So consumers or demand would be inelastic here. For supply, there we had what? 40 was the percentage change in the quantity supplied. So the producers are responding by even more than what that initial percentage change in the price was. This fraction is going to be greater than 1. Anytime we have an elasticity that in magnitude is greater than 1, we would say that that's elastic. So supply or producers are going to be elastic to that price change. Consumers or demand is going to be inelastic. Okay. And that was 16, right? Yeah. Any other question, other ones we want to see here? 20. Yep. All right. Yeah. So you'll definitely see a question about revenues and elasticities. So here we've got one where I'm telling you the price of water is going from 1 to 0.75. The elasticity of demand is negative 3.4. Which of the following will happen? So how are total revenues going to change? Okay. So I'm going to draw this out. So once again, with every problem, you can probably draw something out that'll help you. Right? So here, if I've got my quantity, I've got my price, here's my downward sloping demand curve. We said anytime I'm looking at these elasticity total revenue examples, I can kind of stack these graphs where the graph below I'm looking at total revenues. We said what's going to be true is my total revenues are going to be maximized when I'm at that unit elastic point, or the elasticity of demand is equal to 1 on my demand curve. We said for high prices, right, or the upper part of the demand curve, that because that percentage change in price will be small, percentage changes in quantity demanded will be high. We're thinking about this elasticity of demand. What that would imply is that for high prices, this is going to be a relatively small number. For low quantities, which is right here, relatively high number. So when my percentage change in the quantity demanded is greater than the percentage change in price, I know this fraction is going to be greater than 1, or our demand curve starts out as elastic. It eventually then becomes unit elastic, and if we kind of continue to go down even further, now I've got relatively small prices, so the percent change in price is large. Higher quantities, the percentage change in quantity will be low. Now I'm on this inelastic portion of my demand curve. So here we were told the elasticity is negative 3.4. So this is where when we're talking about the price elasticity of demand, it's always going to be negative. We kind of take the absolute value when we're trying to determine whether or not it's elastic or inelastic. So 3.4 is greater than 1. So we know that we're somewhere on the elastic portion of our demand curve. In fact, we're told we're moving between the prices of what? $1.75. And that really in between here, that's where our elasticity was negative 3.4, or in absolute terms, 3.4. So we know we're on the elastic portion of our demand curve, and we're told that, was it decrease the price? Yeah, we're decreasing the price, okay? So if I decrease the price here, right, I'm moving towards that unit elastic point. Remember, the unit elastic point is where total revenues are maximized. So no matter what portion of the demand curve I'm on, if I'm changing the price so that I'm moving towards the unit elastic point, total revenues should be going up. But another way you can kind of visualize that is think about, okay, when I'm on the elastic portion, by lowering the price, selling more units, what's happening to total revenues? They're going up, okay? If I had instead told you that the elasticity was, I don't know, negative 0.2, well, then you would know you're somewhere on the inelastic portion of your demand curve. There, and this obviously it wouldn't be on the same graph. I'm just using this so I don't have to read or draw everything out again. There, if you saw a decrease in the price, well, now what's happening to my total revenues? If I'm on the inelastic portion and I decrease price, I'm moving away from that unit elastic point, or total revenues would be decreasing. Okay. So you need to know how a price change will change total revenues. You need to know whether or not you're on the elastic or inelastic portion of your demand curve, which would be something that you're given in that problem. You're not told specifically it's elastic, but you're given what the actual elasticity is. You would then need to kind of combine those, principles of knowing that it's elastic when it's in magnitude greater than 1, and then once you're on the elastic portion, thinking about how that matches up with that total revenue graph. Okay. Any other questions on that one? Kind of other problems that you want to see worked through? Okay. No other questions? So I'll choose one I think is, okay, there we go. 19. Okay, I was going to say, we'll do 18 and 19 because I think both of these are trickier ones. Or I shouldn't say, I shouldn't use this word of tricky, but it's a little bit more difficult, not as intuitive, maybe is the right word to use. So we're talking about cross price elasticities, right? First of all, if I'm looking at these options, what does the cross price elasticity tell me about two goods? Whether or not they are substitutes or complements. So if you answer A or B here, you didn't do enough studying, right? Our cross price elasticity, the sign will tell us whether or not goods are substitutes or complements. What would tell us whether or not goods are normal or inferior? Our income elasticity, okay? So we can think about for this cross price elasticity, what that's looking at is, oh, hold on, I'm on autopilot. So let's go cross price elasticity. So it's cross price. So we're going to be thinking about a percentage change in the price of some other good. How is that going to impact the quantity demanded for good X? Right? And if it wants to, quantity demanded here. So in our example, we were told that this elasticity is 1.8. Okay. So it's positive. If this elasticity is positive, I could think of two scenarios where that would be true. If price went up in good Y, and for us, what were the two goods? I think marijuana and, so what do we have here? Alcohol and marijuana. So, my two goods were marijuana and then alcohol. So if the price of marijuana goes up, and as a result, people consume more alcohol, what must that mean? Well, that they were substituting away from the more expensive good, buying the other good, they're substituting, right? So a positive cross price elasticity tells us that these are substitute goods. Now you could also think about the flip side. What if the price of marijuana goes down, and as a result, people buy less alcohol? Well, that means they must be buying more of the relatively cheaper good, less of the other. They're substituting. Negative over negative would give you a positive cross price elasticity. What if instead this cross price elasticity was something like negative 0.5? Well, what that would mean is that anytime I see the price of marijuana go up, people are buying less alcohol. That's the only way I would have like a negative result from this fraction here. So if the price of good Y goes up, and as a result, people buy more, sorry, not more. In this example, we're doing the second one, less of good X, that must mean that they're using these two goods together. So this is the idea. If the price of batteries goes up, whatever requires batteries, people are going to be less likely to want to buy as much, right? So anytime they're going in opposite directions, or it's less than zero, that tells us that these two goods must be complements. Okay. And I might make this question even a little bit more tricky. Maybe I tell you the percent change in the price of good Y, the percent change in the quantity of good X, you calculate the elasticity, and then you have to determine whether or not it's a substitute or a complement. Right? So you might have to compute the cross price elasticity. So in this example, let's say I told you the change in the price of marijuana is, oh, I don't know, just to make this easier on myself, 10. The resulting change in the quantity of alcohol is that it goes up by 18. I then compute that elasticity now that I know the value. So that might be like the first part of the question. The fact that it's positive tells me these are substitute goods. Okay. And then kind of tying this into 18. So we said A and B didn't make any sense when we're looking at a cross price elasticity. What if I was looking at an income elasticity? So we can use the midpoint method, just like we did for the price elasticity of demand. We can use it to find the percent change in anything. So this example would be, I can use it to find the percent change in income. So I've got two income values, and I've got the resulting kind of two quantities. Okay. Now, if it helps us here, I said, instead of 40 and 50,000 to make this easier on your calculator, you can use 40 and 50. It will give us the same values. So we'll kind of use 40 and 50, kind of, the units are thousands here. That will be our income. 10 and 20 are the two corresponding quantities. Let's calculate that income elasticity. And then also, what does that tell us? Are these normal or inferior goods? Well, First of all, if I'm thinking about calculating this elasticity, income went up, people bought more shoes, so which of these should I be able to rule out right away? B and D? That doesn't make any sense, right? It can't be negative. If both of these changes are positive, the percent changes will be positive, okay? Excuse me. So how would I use my midpoint formula, right? So if I have my income elasticity of demand, that's my percentage change in the quantity demanded in response to a percentage change in income. How do I find the percentage change in quantity demanded? That's just take the change in my quantity demanded, divide that by the average. How do I find the average of two numbers? Simply add them up, divide by 2. And then how do I find a percentage change in income? Same kind of idea. Take the change in income, divide it by the average, right? Now it's just a matter of getting my values plugged in, right? So I think we had what? 12 and 10 were our quantities. And this is where, if it helps, I don't have to like enter this all into my calculator at once. I can hopefully so if I write the whole thing out, my income was what? 50 and 40,000, 50 plus 40 over 2. I might be able to see, like, before I put this in my calculator, if I don't want to screw up parentheses. So this was what? 2 over, what's the average of 10 and 12? 11. And then here I had what? 10. What's the average of 40 and 50? 45. Maybe I compute these even, so I have even fewer kind of parentheses to worry about. But what I should end up with here, I think, is that, what? Let me see. So what? 2 over 10. This should be a higher value, so this elasticity should be less than 1, if I'm looking at this correct. So even before I do the calculation, I'm guessing the answer is A here, if I'm doing math in my head correct, but we can double check. Oops. So here we've got what? This is going to be, what's 2 over 11? 0.18. And then this is going to be what? So just 10 over 4.5. Oops. Not 4.5, 45. Should give us 0.22. So remember, these represent, oh, I don't know if you can see this, sorry. You couldn't. So there, that percentage change in my quantity was less than the percentage change in income. This is going to be something that's less than 1. Okay, so I think this works out to be that point, what? 8, was it 1/8? Yeah, yep. Okay. Now, the fact that it's positive, right, tells me that these two goods are what? Well, if I have an increase or a positive change in income, and as a result, I saw an increase or a positive change in the quantity demanded, when I have more money, I'm buying more of this. Those were our normal goods. Right? So when our income elasticity is greater than 0, these are normal goods. Anytime, if we were to compute this, if it was less than 0, then these would be inferior goods. Okay. So if instead this problem had said that the pairs of shoes went from 12 to 10, well, now I've got an increase in income, but they're decreasing how much they buy of these shoes. I would have the same calculation, it's the same values, but now it's negative 0.1818, and that would tell me that these are inferior goods. Okay. But the original problem, we had a positive change in both, so we know it's positive, and these must be normal goods. Okay. Any other questions that people want to see here? Just about 30 minutes here. Okay. Oh, let me look at this. So let's think about this one, since we kind of covered this on a separate day. if I'm thinking about surpluses and shortages, so if I gave you a graph that looks something like this, right? And I said, what's the, let's say the government comes in, puts a price ceiling, they're only charging $20. Well, what's true that at $20, the point that I'm at on my supply curve, quantity supplied, is less than my quantity demanded. So if more people want to buy this good than that was currently being produced, I would have a shortage. What's the value of the shortage? It's just that difference between my quantity supplied and quantity demanded. So 120 minus 40, that would be that shortage of 80 units. Okay. Another thing I could do is, instead of giving you the visual, let's say I told you the current equilibrium price is 40. Okay. So if I didn't draw this out for you and I had like 15 where I said, if instead the price is set at 60, which of the following do you know is going to be true? So let's say I just told you in an example like this, the current equilibrium price of this good is 40. If instead the price is set at 60, will a surplus or a shortage exist? Well, if I know the equilibrium price, I should be able to draw out my own supply and demand curve where I'm thinking about, all right, I know that if the equilibrium price is 40, that's where supply is going to be equal to demand, or I won't have any surpluses or any shortages. If the price is then ever above that equilibrium, which is what we have here, what would have to be true in that scenario? At these prices, the quantity demanded would actually be less than my quantity supplied. So anytime the price is above the equilibrium price, we know that we're going to have not a shortage, but a surplus. Okay. So even not given that visual, all I have to really tell you is what the equilibrium price is. And then you could tell me whether or not a shortage or a surplus is going to exist. Right? So here, it wouldn't be a shortage, it wouldn't be a surplus at this higher price, unlike problem 14, it wouldn't be a shortage, we would actually have a surplus. Okay. So shortage wouldn't exist, we would actually have a surplus. Right? And relative to when the market is in equilibrium, so we know that A is not true. The new price in the market is lower. Well, it's actually higher, right? So the quantity demanded, quantity supplied, that's what we're going to be thinking about in this problem. Relative to that equilibrium point, I noted that if I'm at a higher price, here, get another color in. The quantity demanded will be less than the equilibrium, and the quantity supplied will be greater than that. So our answer to that one would be, at this higher price, we have a surplus existing. We know that the quantity demanded is going to be lower. The quantity demanded is going to be higher. So, no, I'm looking at this reverse. I keep flipping these two. At this higher price, the quantity demanded will be lower than the equilibrium, and the quantity supplied will be higher. So D doesn't make any sense. The only one that makes sense for us here would be answer B. Okay. And we can kind of get that from kind of just knowing what we know about the supply and demand curve, thinking about where the equilibrium point is. At a higher price, it would have to be the quantity demanded is less than the equilibrium and the quantity supplied is greater. Okay. Any other problems? I'm kind of picking and choosing here, but if anyone has anyone they want to see, could be from old practice problems, really anything. Okay, let me think of another trickier one here. So I think some of these that we didn't go through. Let's do number 9, right? Because I can guarantee you'll see one not exactly like this, but the exact principle, right? So you will have a question that is simultaneous shifts, okay? So in this example, I have input costs are going up, and I also have that the population is going up. How will these two things impact the market for gasoline? Okay, so I will give you something that would shift supply, something that would shift demand, and then ask you about what happens to the new equilibrium. So if I had a market, I got my upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve. and I've got my equilibrium price and quantity where supply is equal to demand. If input prices go up, remember, what does the supply curve represent? The marginal costs. So essentially an increase in input prices is going to be that it is more costly to produce whatever, any quantity. It's now going to cost us more money to produce it, or our marginal costs are going to be going up. Or just intuitively, if it costs more to make something, am I going to want to supply more or less than I was before? At any price, I'd be willing to supply less. So we're going to see this decrease in supply. Right? So if we think about from this initial price and quantity, what would that increase in input prices do? It would cause our equilibrium quantity to go down and our equilibrium price to go up. Okay. So I'm going to kind of keep a running tab down here. So we had, for supply, we had this decrease in supply, leftward shift, moving towards this 0 point. What did that do? It caused the equilibrium price to go up and our equilibrium quantity to go down. Okay. Let's see if I save myself enough room over here. If instead I think about the other thing that's changing, so I've got supply, demand, here's my equilibrium quantity, here's my equilibrium price, okay? If I have more consumers, well, once again, I see, or a higher population, there's more people that will buy this good. What am I going to end up with? I've got a blue marker, I think. Help this, keep this a little bit cleaner. There we go. So more consumers or a higher population, we said, is going to increase demand. Once again, what does an increase in demand look like? Moving away from that 0 point, or at every price, quantity demanded is higher. So what is this higher demand curve due to my equilibrium? It's going to increase quantity, but also increase prices. So if at the same time as I see a supply decrease, I also see a demand increase, that demand increase will also push the price up, but it's going to push quantity up as well. So when I'm thinking about kind of my total effect, if both of these things happen at the same time, what do I definitely know is going to happen to price? Price is definitely going to increase. However, for the equilibrium quantity, I need to know something about the size of the shifts. That's not something that I will give you questions on. We never looked at anything there where I told you one shift was larger than the other. So we would say there, if these simultaneous changes push something in opposite directions, that question mark would represent that that change is indeterminate, or we cannot determine the change. Okay. So for the equilibrium quantity, we can't determine what the change is given this information. For the equilibrium price, we said we know that it's definitely going to increase. Okay. And you could have any combination there of supply increase and demand decrease, both of them increase, both of them decrease, and you would work through them all in the exact same way. So don't draw your shifts on the same graph, because if you do, we went through some examples in class, you can kind of lead yourself to thinking it goes up, that both of them go up or both of them go down. I would use something like this where you're just thinking about kind of the directional changes, using these arrows to really see, oh yeah, these two things are pushing quantity in different directions. We don't know what's going to happen to quantity. Okay. Any other problems that people want to see we haven't covered yet? Okay. All right. So let's go back down here. Did we go through all of these? Was there another one on elasticity that we didn't cover? No, we did those. I would know kind of the traits and thinking about maybe not just a vertical demand curve, but a horizontal demand curve as well. So kind of understanding what the slope, the elasticity is, and whether or not it's vertical or horizontal on a graph of perfectly elastic and inelastic demand. So we said if it's completely vertical, that was going to be we're buying the same amount no matter what the price is. So we're not responding at all. So that no response would be perfectly inelastic. So maybe kind of keeping these things together here. So just, if I've got a kind of the two extremes, here this would represent, well, what's the slope? Maybe it's easier to do this one first. What's the slope of a completely flat line? 0. What's the slope of a completely vertical line? Infinite. Or technically, I guess here, negative infinity. Right? Excuse me. Here, this would represent an elasticity that's equal to what? Well, our elasticity is the percentage change in quantity demanded over our percentage change in price. Take the absolute value. Here, quantity isn't changing at all. So what might elasticity of demand, price elasticity of demand, always be for a completely vertical curve? 0. There's no change in quantity, even when we see changes in price. So if there's no change in quantity, this would be the idea that this is perfectly inelastic. Okay. And then on the flip side, if I've got my elasticity of demand over here, I could see no change in the price, right? And then some change in quantity demanded. So there, people are responding even when there isn't a price change. Anything over 0 would be an elasticity of infinity, right? So these are kind of like exact opposites. And then if you're responding even when there's like no price change, that would mean you're responding a lot, so you're perfectly elastic. Okay. So kind of knowing those two extremes and then moving in between the two, right? As our curve becomes flatter, demand is becoming more elastic. Okay. Any other questions there before we keep moving here? All right. Through that one. That one should be pretty easy. We worked through this one. I would, so here in problems 6 through 9, you have different examples here of like changes in, all these different determinants of supply and demand. I could expect you to know any of them. So I would go back to the slides or your notes and really make sure you understand all of those things that impact supply and demand. So for demand, we had changes in income, right? And that would shift demand differently if it was a normal or inferior good. We had the price of complementary goods, the price of substitute goods. We had just the number of consumers or population. We had, am I forgetting any there? Price expectations. So that's one thing that I don't think is on this practice exam that I might make sure I study. So let's look at one here. Yeah, so let's go through an example of that real quick. In fact, I can combine this into multiple things, right? So let's do supply and demand. So I probably wouldn't be this, use an example where I'm doing a simultaneous shift with price expectations, but maybe it's only that only consumers or only producers expect different prices. But let's say, just to have a complete example, let's say that everybody expects prices are going to be higher in the future. Okay. So if everyone expects that prices are going to be higher in the future, let's think about first, how is that going to impact the equilibrium price and quantity? So if consumers expect there to be higher prices, which way is demand going to shift? So if we're looking at current demand and people think prices are going to be higher tomorrow, what would they try to do today? They'd be more likely to buy it today. So higher expected prices would actually cause our demand curve, our current demand curve, to increase, right? So there we've got price and quantity from that demand increase are going up. Now, if at the same time, it wasn't just consumers that expect higher prices, but also producers. How do price expectations impact producers? Well, if I think the price is going to be higher tomorrow, do I want to supply my good today or tomorrow? I'd like to hold off tomorrow because I'm selling it at a higher price tomorrow. So current supply would actually decrease. Right? And so there I would have a supply decrease. What would that do to my equilibrium quantity and price? Kind of similar to our other example, the supply decrease is going to push price up, but quantity down. So the total effect would be price goes up, change in quantity is indeterminate. Okay. So I likely, like I said, I won't usually probably on the exam, I'm not going to tell you that there's a price expectation and how it's going to impact both. I'd be more likely to give you like one like question, I think 7 or something where it's just one change. But I just wanted to go through this so that we could kind of kill two birds with one stone, where price expectations, higher price expectations will actually increase demand, but decrease current supply. So it has exact opposite effects on supply and demand. Okay. And then you could rework this problem if you wanted to, do a price decrease, right? If expected prices go down, well, that would mean demand decreases, supply increases. I could draw out each one of those changes and then think about what that simultaneous change or what the total effect would be from that. Okay. So make sure you're feeling pretty comfortable with all those things that impact supply and demand, because you can kind of see here, there's at least going to be probably 4 or 5 questions that use these principles about things that are changing and how that's going to shift supply or demand. Okay. And some of them might be as easy as, do you see an increase in supply or demand? Some of them might be more, which one of these would push the equilibrium price up or down, etc., or simultaneous shifts on. Okay. Any other questions that people had I want to see work through, or just a question in general? I could even come up with a question off the top of my head here. Okay. All right. So this practice exam, right, is really good, especially for that module 2 through kind of 4 material. If you're worried, and I think that should be easier problems, but any questions I'd ask you from these practice exam or practice problems from like week 1, right? I would kind of review these as well. Maybe not as much the definitional stuff, but especially something like this. So really the first principles we talked about that might show up from module 1 in the exam would be something like, what's the opportunity cost of doing a certain activity? So this is where you want to be careful, right? So if I had something like this where I gave you 3 activities, your opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative. It's not all the other alternatives. It's just the next best. So here, if I can go golfing, watch a movie, or take a nap, if I choose to go golfing, right, what would my opportunity cost be? Well, if I'm going golfing, I value going to a movie at $23, napping at 62. Has the highest value of what I'm not doing? Taking a nap. So that value, that's what I'm giving up. That's my opportunity cost of going golfing here. If I instead had said, what's the opportunity cost of taking a nap? Well, then what's the value of the next best alternative? That would be golfing. There, my opportunity cost would only be 36. Okay. And then the idea we also talked about was people will choose to do something as long as the marginal cost is less than or equal to that marginal benefit, or marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. So in this example, if I got an Uber driver, 20 hours or $20 an hour, 5 hours, if instead you do choose not to work, what's your opportunity cost? Well, what did you give up? I could have made $100. That's my opportunity cost. What if instead I'm thinking about walking or choosing to hire an Uber? Well, if it costs 10, the marginal cost is 10. The only way I'll choose to do something is if that marginal benefit is greater than or equal to that marginal cost. Okay. And then thinking about maybe like a table example like this. If I know the price is 7 to consumers, what is the price? That's their marginal cost. So how many units or how many beers will I drink here? Well, as long as that marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, I'll choose to buy the first, second, third, fourth. I wouldn't buy the fifth because the marginal benefit is now below marginal cost, so I'd stop at that quantity of 4. Okay. So yeah, really, I don't know, from module 1, the main takeaways are how to kind of think about these opportunity costs, but then also when people are making optimal decisions, they'll choose to do something as long as that marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. Now, we also talked about something in module 1 that kind of set us up for the next 2 modules, which is that even if I don't think about this in terms of supply and demand, as people buy more of something or they consume more of something, what's happening to my marginal benefits? Well, the very first unit is going to provide me a really high marginal benefit. However, the second unit, well, I've already got one, I still like it, but it's not near as valuable as having that first. This is the idea that as quantity increases, we said the marginal benefit to consumers is going to be decreasing, or this law of diminishing marginal benefit. And then we also kind of set us up for supply with that production possibilities curve. We said, remember, as I'm producing more of something, what's happening to the slope? It's getting steeper. So the marginal cost as I produce more of something is going to be increasing, right? Or even at the consumer level, if I'm choosing to do, buy something, the cost to me, I'm giving up dollars I would have spent on more and more valuable items. So increasing marginal cost, decreasing marginal benefits, and really we're just looking at in a slightly different context once we got to thinking about those same principles apply to supply and demand. Okay. All right. Just got 7 minutes here. Any other questions that you want to see worked through? I probably got time for maybe one more if someone has one that they're really dying to see. Okay. So I'll also go to the home page here. This should be an easy one today. Got this set up, triple checked. The scoring should work correct. So for some of you yesterday on that last question, I had to go in and kind of manually give you the points for it. I think everything should be working correct on this one. I know it is because I did it before class. But I don't know, just me wanting to collect some information from you, kind of looking at results and then kind of thinking about which module do you feel the most nervous about or about the problem, the most uneasy about the questions from for this first midterm. And then moving forward and thinking about, for those of you who are attending these live lectures, would you kind of like the kind of similar format of the class? So same amount of time in the slides and the dot cam, you kind of look at those practice problems on your own. Or would you prefer me going through things a little bit quicker in class? So maybe not spending as much time on the slides or giving as much of an in-depth look at some of these principles, but trying to reserve a little bit more time at the end of classes to start reviewing practice problems from those Word documents. Okay. So there's no right or wrong answer here. This is a preference-based thing. If you, I can kind of show you on the, well, I don't want to edit the copy, but on the back side, no matter what response you pick here, you'll get 2 points for each, kind of being the total 4 points for the quiz. Okay. And then I'll look at those results and kind of adjust or not adjust based off of your responses when we come back from this little hiatus, not having class on Friday because of July 4th, when we come back on Monday. Okay. The other thing I want to mention before ending this video, right? So we got participation quizzes. I might post an announcement to reiterate because those of you who are here, it likely doesn't apply to you. But if you haven't gotten on yet, that module 3 quiz, the module 4 quiz, and all of the participation kind of quizzes from this week are all due by the end of the day today, right? Because that exam is tomorrow. So make sure you're getting all of those assignments submitted by 11:59 tonight, if you haven't already. Then tomorrow, we've got that exam, that 4-hour time block. You'll see the exam pop up in this category down here, right? And then I will also publish after the exam tomorrow at 3:15. I'll have it set so that this module pops up I don't want you to have to worry about that until after you've taken the exam. But that module 5 and 6, we're going to be combining together. So when we come back on Monday, I'll have expected that you went through that top hat assignment for module 6. Okay. So module 5, I think I have it set, and I'll add it after the fact, but I didn't want to confuse anyone. You can still find it in the assignments tab, and I've got it under, where is it at? Just for review. So I'll kind of have this published, but the only one that you have to do before we meet in class on Monday will be this module 6 assignment. So you can kind of see I have it set to release or be published tomorrow as soon as the exam is over, and then it's due before we meet in class on Monday. Okay? Any other questions about the exam? Anything before we kind of end this here? Okay, stop.